The bells of St. Aldrich's Cathedral rang with a cold, iron sound that cut through Eliza Harrow's chest like a blade. She stood at the altar, barely 18, her fingers trembling inside lace gloves that had once belonged to her mother. The veil pressed against her lips, tasting of dust and incense, while hundreds of eyes watched her as though she were a relic being auctioned to the highest bidder. Beside her loomed Duke Bernard of Ravenshollow, a man more than 3 times her age, his heavy body wrapped in velvet and gold, his breath sour with wine even before the vows were spoken. The marriage had been decided long before Eliza learned what love was supposed to feel like, long before she understood that her life could be signed away with a handshake between powerful men. Her father stood in the front pew, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the marble floor. He had once promised her freedom, laughter, a future shaped by her own choosing. But debts had swallowed his promises whole. Raven's hollow gold had saved the Harrow estate from ruin, and in return Eliza had become the price. The Duke's hand closed around hers, thick fingers squeezing too tightly, as if reminding her that she was no longer her own. The priest's voice echoed, ancient words binding her fate while her heart screamed in silence. When the vows ended, the cathedral erupted into polite applause. Eliza felt nothing but a hollow ringing in her ears. She was led down the aisle like a prized possession, her steps slow, her head bowed. Outside, the sky was gray, the air heavy with an approaching storm. Ravenshollow Castle waited beyond the hills, a fortress of stone and shadow where she would now live as a duchess in name, a prisoner in truth. The journey to the castle passed in silence. The Duke sat across from her in the carriage, studying her as one might study a horse before purchase. Eliza kept her eyes on the window, watching fields blur into forests, her reflection pale and ghost-like in the glass. She wondered if anyone would notice if she simply vanished into those trees, if freedom could be found by running until her lungs burned and her feet bled. But the carriage doors were locked, and armed guards rode alongside, ensuring the bargain was delivered intact. Ravenshollow Castle rose from the mist like a monument to despair. Its towers pierced the sky, black against the fading light. Servants lined the entrance, bowing low as Eliza stepped out, their eyes flicking toward her with curiosity and something else she could not name. Pity, perhaps. Inside, the halls were vast and cold, stone walls swallowing sound, tapestries depicting battles and conquests staring down at her like warnings. This place had been built on dominance, on power taken and never returned. The wedding feast was a blur of forced smiles and clinking glasses. Eliza sat beside the Duke at the high table, barely touching her food. He drank heavily, boasting to his guests about alliances strengthened and bloodlines secured. Each time he laughed, she flinched. She felt as though she were shrinking, becoming smaller with every hour that passed, until there was almost nothing left of the girl she had been that morning. As night fell, the castle seemed to close in around her. Servants led her to the bridal chamber, a room vast and richly decorated, yet suffocating in its grandeur. The bed dominated the space, draped in red velvet, its carved posts twisted like grasping hands. Candles flickered along the walls, casting shadows that danced and merged, forming shapes that made her heart race. This was the moment everyone whispered about, the moment that sealed a marriage beyond ceremony and law. She stood alone for a time, her wedding gown heavy on her shoulders, her breath shallow. She thought of her childhood room, small and warm, of mornings spent running through fields, of dreams whispered to the stars. Tears threatened to fall, but she forced them back. Crying would change nothing. Survival, she realized, would require something else entirely. The door creaked open. The Duke entered, unsteady on his feet, his face flushed from drink. He dismissed the servants with a wave, locking the door behind him. The sound echoed through the chamber, final and absolute. Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears as he approached, his shadow stretching across the floor until it swallowed her whole. He spoke her name slowly, possessively, as though tasting it. She stepped back, her spine brushing the cold stone wall. In that moment, something inside her shifted. Fear was still there, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it stirred a spark of resolve. She would not break tonight. She could not. The Duke reached for her veil, his fingers clumsy. Before he could touch her, a sudden crash of thunder shook the castle, rattling the windows. The candles flickered violently, plunging the room into near darkness. The Duke cursed, turning toward the window. Rain began to lash against the glass, the storm arriving with ferocity, as if the sky itself rebelled against what was happening within those walls. In the chaos, Eliza moved. She slipped away from the wall, her heart pounding as she crossed the room with silent steps learned from years of sneaking through her father's house. Her gaze fell on a side door, partially hidden behind a tapestry. She had noticed it earlier, barely more than a servant's passage. Desperation gave her courage. She reached it just as the Duke turned back, his eyes narrowing in confusion. She pulled the door open and vanished into darkness. The passage was narrow and unlit, the air damp and smelling of stone. Eliza ran, her gown snagging, her breath burning in her chest. Behind her, she heard shouts, the Duke's furious voice echoing through the corridor. She did not look back. She could not. Each step carried her farther from the life that had been chosen for her, closer to an unknown fate that, for the first time, felt like it might belong to her. The passage ended at a small door that opened onto the outer courtyard. Rain soaked her instantly, plastering her hair to her face, but she welcomed it. She ran into the storm, barefoot on cold stone, laughter bubbling up through her tears. Freedom was not yet hers, she knew that. Ravensshallow's walls were high, its reach long. But tonight, she had defied the bargain sealed at the altar. As thunder roared overhead, Eliza Harrow disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a furious Duke, a shattered wedding night, and a destiny that refused to be quietly claimed. Rain battered Eliza's face as she ran through the outer courtyard, her lungs burning, her bare feet slipping on slick stone. The castle alarms had not yet sounded, but she knew they would. Raven's Hollow did not forgive defiance, and it did not lose what it claimed. She tore through an open archway and into the lower gardens, thorned hedges clawing at her gown as if trying to drag her back. She did not stop. Pain no longer mattered. Only distance did. Beyond the gardens lay the forest, a black wall of twisting branches and whispering leaves. Eliza plunged into it without hesitation. Mud sucked at her feet. Roots threatened to trip her, but the trees offered something the castle never had: cover. The storm thickened, thunder masking the sound of her movement. When at last she collapsed beneath an ancient oak, her chest heaving, she pressed her hand over her mouth to silence her sobs. The world felt unreal, as if she had torn herself out of a nightmare and into another, colder one. She stayed there for a long time, counting her breaths, listening for pursuit. When nothing came but rain and wind, she dared to think. She was alone, dressed as a duchess, with no money, no shelter, and no plan. Ravensshallow's lands stretched for miles in every direction. Even if she escaped the castle, the Duke's influence would follow her like a shadow. Yet for the first time, the fear did not paralyze her. It sharpened her thoughts. She would not go back. Death would be kinder than that bed, those walls, that man. At dawn, the storm weakened to a cold drizzle. Eliza rose, her muscles stiff, her gown ruined and heavy with mud. She tore the skirt shorter with trembling hands, exposing scratched legs, then wrapped the fabric around her waist to move more easily. Hunger gnawed at her, but she ignored it, pushing deeper into the forest. She followed the slope downward, reasoning that water led to people, and people meant a chance, however small. By midday, she reached a narrow river. The water ran fast and dark, swollen by rain. She followed its edge until the trees thinned and smoke curled into the sky ahead. A village. Her heart leapt and sank at the same time. Villages talked. Villages remembered faces. Still, she had no choice. She stepped into the open, lowering her head, trying to look like anything but a runaway bride from Raven's Hollow. The villagers stared. Her clothes, though torn, were fine. Her accent marked her as educated. An old woman approached her cautiously, eyes sharp with suspicion. Eliza swallowed her pride and spoke the truth, or part of it. She said she had fled a cruel marriage. She said she feared for her life. She did not say the name of the man she had escaped. The name alone carried chains. The old woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. She led Eliza to a small cottage at the edge of the village and gave her dry clothes and bread. Eliza ate as if she had never tasted food before, tears slipping down her face with every bite. Kindness felt foreign, almost painful. When she finished, the woman warned her gently. Riders had already passed through at dawn, asking questions, offering gold for information about a missing duchess. Panic surged. Eliza thanked the woman and left before fear could change her mind. She followed a narrow road away from the village, keeping to the trees when she could. By nightfall, exhaustion dragged at her limbs. She stumbled upon a derelict hunting lodge, its roof sagging, its door hanging loose. It was not safe, but it was hidden. She curled up inside, shivering, clutching a broken chair leg like a weapon, and slept. She dreamed of the cathedral, of the Duke's hand closing around her wrist, of vows that turned into chains. She woke with a gasp, heart racing, dawn light filtering through broken boards. Voices drifted from outside. Men, horses. She froze, barely daring to breathe. Through a crack in the wall, she saw them, armed riders bearing Raven's Hollow colors. They dismounted, scanning the area. One laughed, saying she could not have gone far. Another said women always broke eventually. Something hardened inside Eliza then, something colder than fear. She waited until they moved away, then slipped out the back and fled again, this time heading north, toward the mountains she remembered from childhood maps. The land grew harsher, the paths steeper. Blisters formed, burst, and bled. She welcomed the pain. It reminded her she was alive. Days passed in a blur of hunger, cold, and constant motion. She avoided towns, stealing vegetables from fields at night, drinking from streams. Each time she saw riders in the distance, her heart slammed against her ribs. Once, arrows struck the ground near her feet, and she ran until her vision tunneled and her legs nearly gave out. She learned to move silently, to read the forest, to hide her tracks in water and stone. The girl raised for parlors and lessons was disappearing, replaced by someone leaner, sharper, forged by necessity. On the fifth night, she collapsed near a mountain pass, unable to take another step. Snow dusted the ground, stinging her skin. She knew she would die there if she did not find shelter. Just as despair threatened to swallow her, she saw a faint light ahead, flickering between rocks. Summoning her last strength, she staggered toward it. The light came from a small cabin nestled against the mountainside. Smoke curled from its chimney. Eliza knocked, her fist weak against the wood. The door opened to reveal a man with dark hair and wary eyes, a sword at his side. He took in her condition in an instant. The torn clothes, the bloodied feet, the exhaustion etched into her face. She expected questions, accusations. Instead, he stepped aside and let her in. The warmth hit her like a wave. She collapsed just inside the doorway, consciousness slipping. As darkness claimed her, she heard his voice, low and steady, promising she was safe, at least for the night. For the first time since the cathedral bells rang, Eliza allowed herself to believe it might be true. Eliza woke slowly, warmth seeping into her bones before memory returned. The scent of pine smoke and boiling herbs filled the air. For a brief, fragile moment, she did not remember the cathedral, the Duke, or the storm. Then the past crashed back, and she sat up with a sharp breath, eyes darting to the corners of the small cabin. She was lying on a narrow bed near the hearth, wrapped in thick wool blankets. Her feet had been cleaned and bandaged with surprising care. A fire crackled softly, casting orange light across rough wooden walls lined with tools and drying herbs. Near the table stood the man who had opened the door to her, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair tied back, his expression guarded but not unkind. "You're awake," he said calmly. "That's good." Eliza's fingers tightened in the blankets. Where am I? North of Raven's Hollow lands, he replied. High enough that riders don't come often. My name is Rowan. Relief and fear collided inside her. North meant distance. North meant danger too. She searched his face for cruelty and found none, only caution. Why did you help me? She asked. Rowan shrugged slightly. Because you would have frozen to death on my doorstep. And because men don't run like that without reason. His gaze sharpened. Neither do women. She hesitated, then chose honesty again, at least the kind that kept her alive. I ran from my husband. Something flickered in his eyes. Recently married? Yesterday, she said. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the fire. Rowan nodded once, as if that explained everything. Then you can stay until you're strong enough to move on. But you should know, Raven's Hollow riders have been asking questions, even up here. They're offering gold. A lot of it. Eliza swallowed. Will you take it? Rowan met her gaze steadily. If I wanted gold, I wouldn't live alone in the mountains. That night, Eliza slept deeply, the kind of sleep born of exhaustion rather than peace. Over the next days, she recovered slowly. Rowan brought her food, stew thick with root vegetables, bread still warm from the fire. He said little, but his actions spoke for him. He never entered the room without announcing himself. He kept his distance, as if understanding how fragile trust could be. As strength returned to her limbs, Eliza helped where she could, cleaning, cooking, learning the rhythms of mountain life. Rowan hunted and trapped, moving with quiet confidence through terrain that would have terrified her days earlier. At night, they spoke in low voices by the fire. He told her he had once served a noble house as a soldier, until war taught him how easily power crushed those beneath it. He had left and never looked back. She did not tell him the name of the man she had married. Not yet. The illusion of safety shattered on the seventh day. Eliza was gathering water from the stream when she heard hooves. Her heart seized. She dropped the bucket and ran, breath tearing from her lungs as she burst into the cabin. They're here, she whispered urgently. Rowan was already moving, grabbing his sword, his jaw tightening. How many? At least 4. He cursed softly. Go. There's a path behind the cabin. It leads higher. Don't stop. What about you? She asked. I'll slow them down. Fear twisted inside her. She did not want another man risking his life because of her, but she understood the choice he was making. She nodded and fled, climbing the narrow path as fast as her healing feet allowed. Snow crunched beneath her steps, the air thinning with altitude. Below, voices rose, shouts, commands, the unmistakable sound of men used to being obeyed. Steel rang against steel. Eliza forced herself not to turn back. She reached a rocky outcrop and hid, crouching low, watching the cabin through a veil of snow and breath. She saw Rowan fighting with brutal efficiency, using the terrain to his advantage. 2 riders fell, but numbers told their own story. One man broke away, scanning the mountainside. Their eyes met. Duchess, the man shouted triumphantly. By order of Duke Bernard, you are to return at once. The name hit her like a physical blow. There was no hiding now. She rose slowly, her hands shaking, and stepped into the open. Rowan shouted her name in warning, but it was too late. The riders advanced, weapons raised. Then a horn sounded, deep, resonant, not Ravensshallow's call. From the ridge above, figures emerged. Men and women wrapped in dark cloaks, bows already drawn. The riders froze, confusion rippling through them. The newcomers moved with practiced unity, arrows notched, blades ready. Leave, a woman's voice commanded from the ridge. Or die here. The Raven's Hollow men hesitated. Gold or not, these mountains belong to someone else. With curses and threats, they mounted and retreated, dragging their wounded with them. Eliza's knees buckled as the danger passed. Rowan climbed toward her, blood staining his sleeve, but his eyes alive. The cloaked figures descended, surrounding them. The woman who had spoken stepped forward, her gaze sharp, assessing. You brought trouble to our border, she said to Rowan. And you saved us anyway, he replied evenly. The woman studied Eliza. Who are you? Eliza straightened, something new awakening in her chest. Fear was still there, but so was defiance. Someone who refuses to be owned. The woman's lips curved slightly. Then you're welcome among us. We protect those who cannot return to the world that hunts them. Rowan looked at Eliza, questioning. She looked back at the mountains, at the path she could never safely walk again. Then she nodded. As they were led away into the high passes, Eliza understood something with crystal clarity. She was no longer running blindly. She was choosing her ground. And somewhere far below, in a castle built on arrogance and control, a duke would soon learn that the girl he had tried to claim had become something far more dangerous, a woman who would not come back quietly. The mountain refuge lay hidden beyond a series of narrow passes, carved into stone and shadow, as if the land itself wished to protect it. Eliza was led through winding paths where mist clung low and the wind carried the scent of pine and snow. The people who guided her moved with purpose and silence, their faces hard but not cruel. These are not bandits or exiles broken by the world. They were survivors who had chosen resistance over submission. The settlement revealed itself gradually. Stone dwellings built into the mountainside, smoke rising discreetly from hidden chimneys, watchtowers disguised as jagged rock. Life thrummed quietly within it. Children practiced archery under careful eyes. Women sharpened blades and mended armor. Men trained with discipline that spoke of long experience. This was not merely a refuge. It was a stronghold. Eliza was given clean clothes, sturdy boots, and a small room overlooking a steep ravine. That night, as she lay on a straw mattress beneath thick furs, sleep refused to come. The safety she felt was fragile, balanced on the knowledge that Raven's Hollow would not stop hunting her. Duke Bernard had lost more than a bride. He had lost control, and men like him did not forgive that wound to their pride. The woman who had spoken on the ridge returned the next morning. Her name was Mara. She was the leader of the mountain faction, a former noblewoman who had abandoned her title after her lands were seized by the same elite who now ruled through fear and wealth. Mara spoke plainly, without ceremony. "You can stay," she told Eliza, "but only if you contribute. We are not a sanctuary for weakness." Eliza nodded. "I will learn." Training began immediately. It was brutal, humbling work. Eliza's hands blistered as she learned to draw a bow. Her muscles screamed as she climbed cliffs and practiced hand-to-hand combat. She fell more times than she could count, but she rose each time, teeth clenched, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Rowan trained beside her, offering quiet guidance, never pity. Weeks turned into months. Winter tightened its grip on the mountains, and with it came discipline and transformation. Eliza's body grew leaner, stronger. Her movements became deliberate. The fear that had once ruled her every breath slowly gave way to something steadier. Focus. At night, she studied maps and listened to strategy meetings. She learned which trade routes fed Ravensshallow's wealth, which allies feared the Duke but resented him deeply. One evening, a scout returned with urgent news. Duke Bernard had declared Eliza legally insane, claiming grief and hysteria had driven her to flee. A reward was placed on her head, doubled for anyone who returned her alive. The word struck like ice. Alive mattered. It meant the Duke still intended to reclaim what he believed was his. Eliza stood before Mara and the council, her voice calm despite the fury coiling inside her. "He will never stop," she said. "Not until I am either caged or dead." Mara studied her carefully. "And what do you propose?" Eliza lifted her chin. "We stop him first." The room fell silent. Rowan's gaze snapped to her, conflicted. He knew the danger in what she was suggesting. Challenging a duke meant war, open or hidden. But Eliza had crossed a line long ago. There was no path back to obedience. Over the following weeks, plans formed in whispers and inked lines across parchment. Supply lines were sabotaged. Messengers disappeared. Rumors spread through border towns, stories of the Duke's cruelty resurfacing, his alliances weakening under scrutiny. Raven's Hollow began to feel pressure it did not understand, like cracks forming beneath a grand hall. Eliza took part in her first mission under a moonless sky. Disguised as a merchant's assistant, She entered a town loyal to the Duke, her heart hammering as familiar banners fluttered overhead. Each step felt like walking back into a past that still tried to claim her. But she did not freeze. She delivered forged letters, planted seeds of doubt, and left before dawn without being seen. When she returned to the mountains, Mara looked at her with new respect. "You're no longer just running," she said. "You're shaping the fight." Eliza felt it then, the final severing of who she had been. The girl forced down an aisle at 18 was gone. In her place stood a woman forged by betrayal and survival, one who understood power and intended to reclaim it. Far below, in Raven's Hollow Castle, Duke Bernard stared at reports piling on his desk. Lost shipments, silent allies, unrest among his tenants. Rage twisted his face. Somewhere, his runaway bride was not only alive but dangerous. And for the first time since the wedding night, uncertainty crept into his heart. The game had begun, and Eliza was no longer a piece on his board. Winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains, and with the thaw came movement. Raven's Hollow stirred like a wounded beast, lashing out blindly as its control weakened. Duke Bernard's men rode harder, questioned more harshly, punished more publicly. Villages that once bowed without resistance now whispered, and whispers were dangerous. Eliza listened to every report with a growing understanding of how fear ruled, and how it could be turned against the one who wielded it. Mara summoned Eliza and Rowan before dawn one morning. A map lay spread across the stone table, its edges weighed down by knives. "The Duke will attend the Founders' Convocation in 3 weeks, Mara said. "All the regional lords will be there. If Bernard appears weak, they will circle him like wolves." Eliza studied the marked roads and towns. The convocation was more than ceremony. It was legitimacy. "He will make an example of someone," she said quietly, "to prove he still holds power." Mara nodded. "A public execution, likely in Greyhaven." Greyhaven. The name sent a chill through Eliza. It was a city she had visited as a child, bright with markets and music. Now it was under Ravenshallow's heel. "We can't let that happen," Eliza said. "If he kills openly, fear will win." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Stopping it will put you directly in his sight." "I know," Eliza replied. "That's why it has to be me." Preparation consumed every waking hour. Disguises were sewn, routes memorized, contingencies argued and refined until there were no easy answers left. Eliza practiced speaking again with the accent of the court, the careful cadence of a duchess who knew how to command a room. Each word tasted bitter, but she wielded them like weapons. They entered Greyhaven as travelers, the city gates looming high and unforgiving. Banners bearing the Duke's sigil hung from stone walls, bright and defiant. Soldiers lined the streets. Eliza felt eyes on her constantly, imagined recognition in every glance. She forced herself to breathe, to walk steadily, to become invisible by appearing ordinary. The square was already crowded when the scaffold was raised. People gathered not out of loyalty, but necessity. Absence was noticed. Fear ensured attendance. Eliza pushed through the mass, her heart pounding as she saw the condemned, a young man accused of smuggling grain to starving villages. His crime was mercy. Trumpets sounded. Duke Bernard rode into the square on a black horse, draped in crimson and gold. He looked every inch the ruler, confident, unchallenged. Eliza's stomach twisted. This was the man who had owned her with a signature, who believed the world existed to obey him. He began to speak, his voice carrying easily. He spoke of order, of betrayal, of the cost of defiance. Each word was calculated, polished by years of unopposed authority. The crowd listened in tense silence. Then Eliza stepped forward. Her hood fell back as she climbed the steps of the fountain at the square's center. Gasps rippled outward as faces turned, recognition sparking like fire through dry grass. She raised her voice, steady and clear. "You speak of betrayal," she said, "but you are its living symbol." The square froze. Bernard's eyes locked onto her. For a heartbeat, shock cracked his composure. Then fury surged, dark and consuming. "Seize her," he roared. Arrows flew. Chaos exploded as Mara's people moved. Smoke bombs shattered against stone. Shouts and screams merged. Eliza stood her ground, meeting Bernard's gaze. "You bought a child and called it marriage," she continued. "You rule by terror and call it law. And today, everyone sees you for what you are." Soldiers surged toward her, but the crowd shifted, confusion breaking obedience. Someone threw a stone. Another shouted in agreement. Fear fractured. Rowan reached her side, pulling her back as smoke swallowed the square. They vanished into the disorder, slipping through alleys and hidden passages planned long before the first trumpet sounded. By nightfall, Greyhaven buzzed with rumor. The execution never happened. Bernard withdrew under heavy guard, his authority publicly challenged for the first time. Word spread faster than his riders could contain it. In the mountains, Mara listened to the reports in silence. Then she turned to Eliza. "You've crossed a point of no return." Eliza nodded. She felt strangely calm. "So has he." Far away, Duke Bernard stared into a mirror, his face pale, his hands shaking with rage. Eliza's voice echoed in his mind, louder than the crowd, louder than his own commands. She was no longer just a problem. She was a threat to everything he was, and he would destroy her or be destroyed by her. The aftermath of Greyhaven rippled across the region like a shockwave. Markets buzzed with rumors, taverns hummed with daring talk, and for the first time in years, people spoke the Duke's name without lowering their voices. Duke Bernard responded as men like him always did, by tightening his grip. Taxes rose overnight. Patrols doubled. Curfews were enforced with violence. He needed fear restored quickly, before doubt hardened into defiance. Eliza knew this pattern now. Power, when threatened, revealed its ugliest truths. Scouts returned to the mountains with grim news. Bernard had convened his council and declared open war on the mountain insurgents, blaming them for poisoning the minds of his subjects and abducting his lawful wife. A bounty was placed not only on Eliza, but on anyone sheltering her. Villages suspected of sympathy were punished. Grain stores burned. Children went hungry. Eliza listened in silence as report after report was delivered. Each story carved something deeper into her resolve. "He's trying to force me out," she said finally. "If I surrender, the violence stops." Rowan slammed his fist against the table. "He'll kill you." "Yes," Eliza replied evenly. "But he'll kill them anyway if I don't act." Mara watched her closely. "You're thinking like a leader," she said. "But leaders must choose where sacrifice matters." That night, Eliza could not sleep. She stood at the edge of the ravine, staring down into darkness, the wind tugging at her cloak. She thought of the man on the scaffold, of villages crushed between ambition and survival, of a girl forced into a wedding dress to settle a debt. She understood now that this fight was larger than revenge. It was about breaking a system that devoured the powerless to feed the powerful. At dawn, she made her choice. "We don't meet Bernard on his terms," Eliza told Mara and the council. "We expose him completely, not with speeches, with proof." Bernard's greatest strength was also his weakness, his secrecy. Deals made in shadows. Accounts falsified. Alliances maintained through blackmail and blood. Eliza knew the rhythms of noble houses, the hidden rooms, the ledgers never meant for honest eyes. She had lived among them, learned their language. She knew where the rot would be deepest. The plan was dangerous beyond reason. They would infiltrate Raven's Hollow Castle itself. Rowan objected immediately. "That place is a fortress." "I know," Eliza said. "It was meant to be my prison. That's why I can walk its halls without being noticed. They won't look for a ghost where they believe they already buried her." Preparation was meticulous. Routes mapped, guards bribed or distracted. Eliza dyed her hair darker, dressed as a widow of the lower court, a woman expected to be invisible. Rowan would lead a small team to extract her if things went wrong. Mara prepared contingencies for every outcome, including the one none of them said aloud. Under cover of a moonless night, Eliza crossed the boundary she had once fled in terror. Raven's Hollow Castle loomed ahead, unchanged and yet smaller somehow, its dominance eroded by what she had become. She slipped inside through a servant's entrance, her heart steady, her movements precise. The corridors smelled of wax and stone, just as she remembered. Echoes of her wedding night pressed at the edges of her mind, but she pushed them aside. Fear no longer ruled her. Purpose did. She reached Bernard's private study near midnight. Inside, the desk was cluttered with correspondence, sealed orders, and locked drawers. Eliza worked quickly, hands sure as she copied documents, uncovering proof of illegal levies, secret executions, bribes paid to the Crown's auditors. Each page felt like another chain snapping loose. Then she heard footsteps. The door opened. Duke Bernard stood in the threshold, candlelight carving his features into something sharp and monstrous. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Recognition flared in his eyes, triumph, rage, disbelief all at once. "You should have stayed lost," he said softly. Eliza straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You should never have tried to own me." He advanced slowly, smiling the way predators do when they believe escape is impossible. "You came back to your cage." "No," Eliza replied, slipping the final document into her cloak. "I came back to open it." Shouts echoed in the distance. An alarm bell began to ring. Bernard lunged. Eliza ducked, knocking the candle from his hand. Darkness swallowed the room as smoke filled the air. She ran, heart pounding, footsteps thundering behind her. Guards flooded the halls. Steel flashed. Voices roared. Just as her strength began to fail, a familiar whistle cut through the chaos. Rowan. The extraction was brutal and desperate. They fought their way out through a postern gate as fires broke out across the lower ward. Planned diversions igniting confusion. Arrows hissed past. Pain exploded in Eliza's shoulder, but she kept running, teeth clenched, refusing to fall. They vanished into the forest as dawn crept over the horizon. Safe, barely, back in the mountains, Eliza collapsed, bloodied but alive. Mara knelt beside her as the stolen documents were laid out, damning in their detail. "This," Mara said quietly, "will shatter him." Eliza closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her. Somewhere far below, Duke Bernard raged within empty halls, his secret stolen, his power bleeding away. The war had entered its final phase. Like a silent army. Names, seals, dates, proof written in ink and blood. Eliza watched as Mara and the council read through them, one by one, the weight of what had been uncovered settling heavily over the room. This was not rumor or accusation. This was truth, undeniable and lethal to a man like Duke Bernard. Within days, copies were smuggled out through trusted hands. Merchants carried them hidden among ledgers. Pilgrims memorized passages to repeat word for word. Former allies of the Duke received carefully chosen pages that proved how easily he had betrayed them when it suited him. The truth moved faster than soldiers ever could. Bernard struck back with fury. Messengers arrived breathless with reports. The Duke had declared Eliza a traitor to the realm, accusing her of treason, theft, and witchcraft. He demanded her execution, publicly and painfully. But this time, his words did not land as they once had. Too many people had seen the documents. Too many recognized their own suffering reflected in those pages. Several minor lords withdrew their support. One refused to send troops. Another closed his gates to Raven's Hollow banners. Bernard's circle tightened, not with loyalty, but with fear. He was no longer the unchallenged ruler of the region. He was a man cornered. Eliza's wound healed slowly. Rowan stayed close, saying little, his presence steady. One evening, as snow melted into streams along the mountainside, he finally spoke. "When this ends," he said quietly, "there won't be a simple life waiting for you." Eliza smiled faintly. There never was. The decisive moment came sooner than expected. A royal envoy arrived at the edge of the mountains under a flag of truce. The crown, long content to ignore Bernard's excesses in exchange for gold and silence, could no longer do so. The evidence was too extensive, the unrest too visible. The envoy carried an order. Duke Bernard was to present himself before the High Council to answer for his crimes. Mara turned to Eliza. If he goes alone, he'll bargain. He always does. Eliza understood. Bernard would trade names, lands, lives, anything to save himself. Justice would be diluted, twisted into another quiet arrangement. Then I go too, she said. I am the one he cannot deny. The journey to the capital was tense and heavily guarded. Bernard traveled under watch, his rage contained but simmering. Eliza rode separately, cloaked, her presence known only to a few. When at last they entered the great hall of judgment, the air was thick with anticipation. The High Council sat in judgment beneath towering arches. Nobles filled the benches, whispers spreading like wildfire as Eliza stepped forward and removed her hood. Gasps echoed. Bernard turned, his face draining of color, then contorting with hate. She spoke clearly, without ornament. She told them of the marriage arranged to pay a debt, of the threats, of the violence disguised as authority. She presented the documents, each one dismantling another pillar of Bernard's defense. Witnesses were called, villagers, former soldiers, even a scribe who had once served Bernard and fled in fear. The Duke raged, denied, threatened, but his voice sounded small in that chamber, drowned beneath the weight of truth. When the council withdrew to deliberate, silence pressed in like a hell breath. The verdict was delivered at dusk. Duke Bernard of Ravenshollow was stripped of title, lands, and protection of the crown. He was sentenced to imprisonment for life, his wealth seized to repay those he had wronged. No bargain, no escape. As guards dragged him away, Bernard twisted toward Eliza, his eyes burning. "You ruined me," he hissed. Eliza met his gaze, calm and unafraid. "No," she said. "You did that yourself. I just refused to stay silent." When the hall emptied, Eliza stood alone for a moment, the enormity of it washing over her. The fight that had begun in an altar had ended here, in truth spoken aloud. But she knew something important still remained. Justice had been served. Freedom, however, was something she would have to choose what to do with. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clear, no longer heavy with storms. Eliza stepped into it, no longer a duchess, no longer a fugitive, only a woman who had survived and changed the world that tried to break her. Freedom did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, in fragments, like light breaking through clouds after a long storm. In the weeks following the trial, the realm shifted uneasily, as if unsure how to stand without Duke Bernard's shadow looming over it. Ravenshollow lands were placed under temporary crown control. Taxes were suspended. Prisoners were released. For many, life improved in small but undeniable ways. For Eliza, the world felt strangely vast, stripped of the boundaries that had once defined every step she took. The crown offered her restitution, gold, estates, protection, even a new title if she wished it. She listened politely, then declined. "I will not trade one gilded cage for another," she said. Her refusal unsettled them more than anger would have. They were accustomed to bargains, not boundaries. She returned to the mountains with Rowan and Mara, not as a fugitive, but as a guest who could leave whenever she chose. The stronghold welcomed her with quiet respect. Yet something had changed. The fight that had driven her no longer burned the same way. Victory had cooled it into something steadier, more reflective. Mara noticed. One evening, as they watched the sunset bleed gold across the peaks, she spoke. "You don't belong here anymore." Eliza nodded. "I know. You could stay," Mara continued. "Lead, teach, build something lasting." "I could," Eliza agreed. "But this place survives because it stands apart from the world. I need to be in it." Rowan listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Later, as they walked a narrow trail overlooking the ravine, he asked the question he had been holding back. "Where will you go?" Eliza considered it carefully. For the first time, the answer was not shaped by fear or escape. "To places like Greyhaven," she said. "To villages that still believe suffering is their only option. I want to help them learn otherwise." He stopped walking. "You'll be hunted again. Not by dukes, perhaps, but by people who prefer silence." "I know." Rowan exhaled slowly. "Then you won't go alone." They traveled lightly, without banners or escorts. Eliza dressed plainly, her hair uncovered, her name used only when necessary. In towns and villages, she listened more than she spoke. She learned what justice looked like to people who had never tasted it. Sometimes it was land returned. Sometimes it was a corrupt official removed. Sometimes it was simply being heard without punishment. Word spread, but differently this time. Not as a legend or a rallying cry, but as reassurance. The woman who stood up to a duke did not disappear into comfort. She walked the same roads as everyone else. There were setbacks. A magistrate who smiled and promised reform only to revert once she left. A town too afraid to accept help. A night where stones shattered windows and a warning was left carved into a door. Each time, Eliza felt the old fear stir and then pass. She knew now that fear did not have to decide her actions. Months later, news reached them that Raven's Hollow Castle would be dismantled. The crown had deemed it a symbol too dangerous to preserve. Its stones would be repurposed for schools, bridges, and public halls. When Eliza heard, she closed her eyes, imagining the walls that had once caged her being broken down piece by piece. She did not return to watch. On the anniversary of the trial, Eliza stood in a small square where a public ledger had been installed, listing taxes and judgments openly for all to see. Children played nearby. Merchants argued loudly, without flinching when soldiers passed. The world was not healed, but it was breathing more freely. Rowan joined her, handing her a folded letter. From the capital, he said. It was brief, an invitation to advise the crown on protections for forced marriages and debt settlements. Not power, access, a chance to change the rules quietly, effectively. Eliza looked up, a small smile forming. This, she said, is how it lasts. That night, she wrote in a simple journal, not for history, but for herself. She wrote about the girl who had stood trembling at an altar, about the night she ran into the storm, about the moment she chose to stop running. She wrote not with bitterness, but clarity. Her story was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had refused to surrender. As dawn broke, Eliza Harrow closed the journal and stepped into the waking city, not as a symbol, not as a survivor alone, but as a woman who understood her power and used it carefully, deliberately, and without asking permission. One chapter remained unwritten, and she was ready to begin it. The final chapter did not begin with applause or ceremony. It began with a quiet decision. Eliza stood at the edge of the river outside the city, watching morning light ripple across the water. The journal rested in her hands, its pages filled with a life that already felt distant. Fear, flight, fire, and change. She closed it gently. Stories she had learned were not meant to be lived inside forever. They were meant to be carried forward, transformed into action. The invitation from the crown weighed on her mind. Advisory power was subtle, dangerous in its own way. It could bend laws without drawing swords. It could also be swallowed by compromise. Eliza knew the court well enough to understand both possibilities. Accepting meant stepping back into a world that had once sold her like property. Refusing meant leaving decisions in the hands of those who had never paid the cost of injustice. She chose a third path. Eliza entered the capital not as a noble, not as a symbol, but as a representative of many voices. She brought villagers, widows, former soldiers, and scribes with her, people who had lived under systems designed to break them. She insisted they be heard together or not at all. It disrupted protocol. It unsettled the court. It worked. Policies were rewritten slowly, painfully. Laws against forced marriages were strengthened, debt contracts scrutinized, protections established that could not be undone quietly. Each clause was argued. Each victory was small, but real. Eliza learned patience without surrender, diplomacy without obedience. She spoke less of herself and more of patterns, how power hid, how it repeated, how it could be stopped if named clearly. Not everyone approved. Threats returned, wrapped in polite language and sealed letters. "You are becoming inconvenient," one noble warned her with a smile. Eliza smiled back. Then progress is being made. Rowan remained close, never overshadowing, never leading her path, only walking beside it. Their bond was not born of rescue or debt, but of shared ground. Two people who understood the cost of standing firm. They did not rush to define what they were. Freedom, Eliza knew, also meant choosing without pressure. Years passed. The realm did not become perfect. It became better in ways that mattered. Fewer girls vanished into marriages arranged to balance ledgers. More towns demanded transparency. Some failed, some resisted, but the silence that once protected cruelty no longer held. One spring morning, Eliza returned to the ruins of Raven's Hollow. Grass had grown between broken stones. Children from nearby villages played, where guards once stood watch. The great hall was gone, its stones already reborn as a schoolhouse down the road. Eliza walked slowly through what remained, feeling no triumph, no grief, only closure. She realized then that she had not destroyed a man or a castle. She had broken a pattern. As the sun dipped low, Eliza turned away from the ruins and toward the road ahead. There were still systems to challenge, voices to amplify, truths to protect. But she no longer felt chased by the past or pulled by rage. Her steps were steady, chosen. The girl who had been forced to the altar was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that power did not come from titles, fear, or walls of stone, but from refusing to accept a world that demanded silence in exchange for survival. And that refusal, once claimed, could never be taken away.